Hello and welcome to episode 54 of The Climate Skeptic. I'm your host, Ellie Hodges. Now, Britain's energy policy is usually talked about as a climate issue, but what if it's really a national security issue? Well, joining me now to discuss why he believes the UK's current approach is leaving us more vulnerable is former MI6 chief and host of the One Decision podcast, Sir Richard Dearlove. Welcome to the show, Richard.
Hello, Ellie. I'm very pleased to be on your podcast.
Thank you for joining me. Now, you have argued recently that net zero has become a national security issue rather than simply an environmental or economic one. Why do you believe successive governments have failed to recognise that link?
Well, I think you have to go back a bit and look at the whole issue of national security and defence and recognise the extent to which this has been a sort of neglected area of government funding over a long period of time, particularly the debate about our national defence budget and our expenditure on defence. But if you look at this as a completely integrated problem, what is of fundamental importance to the UK's economy is how we produce our energy, how much we pay for it, and the extent to which we have dependencies which we don't control. So I think that, what I would say is that if you look at the overall picture, you can't separate these issues. And energy is of such importance both to the budget of each one of us, but also it's fundamental to how the economy functions. So you can't sort of put it aside when you're looking at a situation globally where I think there's acknowledgement now that we face significant national security problems internationally, particularly from Russia.
And you compare Britain's net zero policies to the command economies of the Soviet era. Some would say that's an exaggerated comparison. What similarities do you think people are missing?
Well, I agree that it's an extreme example, but I made it, as it were, to make people sit up and think. And the reason I made it is because if you look at climate change as much as an ideology as it is as a fact, you have a set of what I would describe as, well, I'm going to be controversial and say let's say a fashionable obsession, which is many people are sort of obsessed about. And if you look at it, in my opinion, from a purely scientific point of view, we're using that sort of ideological driver to make us consider all issues related to energy, and particularly the issue of climate change. Now, I'm not a climate change denier, but I think what I would say is that the link between man-made climate change and natural climate change, you get into some very controversial areas of science. And I'm certainly of the view that man-made climate change isn't the only cause of the sort of experiences that we're having now in seeing, in recent heat waves. This isn't purely a question of man-made climate change. There are other scientific and meteorological causes.
And you warn that Britain's growing dependence on renewables, imported electricity and undersea interconnectors creates new strategic vulnerabilities. If you were advising our new Prime Minister, Andy Burnham, what would be your top priorities for strengthening Britain's energy security?
Well, to build strongly over the coming years to create energy independence. We have the resources and the capability to do it. So what I mean by that is exploitation of the remaining fossil fuel resources that we have, principally focusing on gas, and I would certainly allow fracking. I think that's really important. Building up our capability on the nuclear side, with really putting a large amount of money into small nuclear reactors. And I'm not saying reduce necessarily renewables, but renewables are an unreliable source of energy. If the sun doesn't shine, the wind doesn't blow. That aspect of the grid is highly entropic. And, actually, I wouldn't say highly chaotic, but you absolutely can't depend on it. And what we're doing is we're building a very unreliable grid, which is dependent also on foreign supplies when we can't generate enough from renewables at certain times and periods of the year. And we just don't, as it were, need that sort of foreign dependence, particularly when we're talking about undersea cable supplies maybe coming from France, who have a surplus because of their nuclear power industry, or we're importing energy from Norway. When we, why on earth are we doing that when we could be producing it ourselves?
Now, one of your most striking claims concerns China's role in Britain's energy infrastructure and electric vehicle market. How real is the threat that Beijing could exploit connected technology during a future geopolitical crisis?
Well, if you look at the facts, very real indeed. Chinese electric cars are basically Chinese computers on wheels. And due to the Internet of Things and the cellular modules in the cars, they can be reprogrammed by the manufacturer in China, let's say at the flick of a switch, without us in the UK being aware that the cars are being interfered with after they've been sold. Let me give you an example, an actual example. During the Russian, that's a slip of the tongue, during the Russian invasion of Ukraine, they captured in the eastern part, the grain-producing agricultural part of Ukraine, a lot of Ukrainian John Deere tractors manufactured by Western manufacturer John Deere. A lot of those tractors using satellite technology and the software in them was switched off so that their use was denied to the Russians. So we have an example that stares us in the face. If we had a crisis with China, let's say over Taiwan, which is, I'm not saying probable, but it's certainly possible, then you could have a situation where the Chinese government immobilized every city in the UK by switching off a number of Chinese electric vehicles. It's as simple as that. The Chinese are brilliant at creating dependencies, which at some future point they could exploit. They create dependencies economically by undercutting the market, by subsidizing their own manufacture, making things absurdly cheap in comparison to their competitors, building a dominant position and knocking out your alternative